Welcome to episode number 58 of 100 Plus, an overview of 100 of the most important people, events, and ideas of the last 2,000 years. This is a survey of the forces and factors that have shaped today's world, Western civilization, the Christian faith, and you. In today's lecture, we're turning our attention back to America. In previous discussions, we have looked at Columbus's voyage, the initial English colonization of North America, the impact of the Puritans, the First Great Awakening, and other things. I also did an episode contrasting the revolutions of the United States and France. In today's episode, we are focusing on the founding of the United States. What is America? Is it a landmass, a nation, a collection of immigrants, a set of ideals established by the documents such as the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the Bill of Rights? Is it something else? Is it unique among the nations? Is it somehow Christian? Was it at one time? If it was, does that still matter today? Are we right in thinking of it as a democracy, or should we call it a republic? And by the way, what's the difference? What are we to make of the Pilgrims? What are we to make of Thomas Jefferson? In some ways, such a brilliant thinker and strategist, he is the one we credit with writing, "All men are created equal," and yet he owned slaves, hundreds of them. Was he a good guy, or should he be canceled? The way we answer these questions and others may say as much about us as they do about America, but it's time that we take them up, or at the very least, we take up some of them. If we're going to continue marching down this path, 100 plus, from Rome to home, from Plato to NATO, we are moving through the last few thousand years, coming up to the present. At the moment, we are focusing on the 18th century. We've recently considered the Enlightenment, the Great Awakening, the rise of higher education, and the rise of capitalism. We've been exploring mostly pre-revolutionary people and events, the Wesleys, George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, and the like. By the way, when I say revolution, I am referring to the U.S. Revolution. There have been 5 big revolutions that get ink when you're thinking about world history. The English Revolution that failed, the U.S. Revolution, which had a similar model. Then we have the French Revolution, which had a very different idea about freedom. And then the 2 big revolutions that followed sort of in the path of the French Revolution, that being the Russian and then the Chinese. So today we're focusing on the U.S. Revolution. We're turning back to it. I said some things about it in an earlier podcast when we were contrasting the U.S. and the French revolutions. But we're going back for a deeper dive, focusing on some of the theological events that contributed to the U.S. Revolution, and then some of the events, theological reflections that came out of it. So let me start by noting that this is a challenging and complicated lecture to write and give. It's not just that some of you know a lot about what happened, and I'm not simply referring to those of you who rewatched Mel Gibson in The Patriot or got all caught up in the recent Hamilton craze. I'm talking about those of you who have done a lot of reading about the past. All you history majors in college, or all of you who have decided you're going to read biographies about all the leading players, Washington and Jefferson and Adams and Hamilton and the like. So it's a challenge because a lot of people already know a lot. It's also a challenge because there are a handful of narratives out there, and they tend to not align with each other, and they all tend to carry a fair bit of emotional freight. And that emotional freight has been growing a lot of recent. There have been contentious school board meetings for decades, right? Agitation over what's going to be taught about history in various grade school classes, about Columbus and his intersection with indigenous native people, about the founding fathers, a phrase that is now politically very incorrect and not supposed to be used, about slavery and about racism. Who are the good guys And who are the bad guys? And what are we supposed to do about the bad guys? As I've noted, there have been debates about all this in the past, but in the last 5 years, it has spiked. There's a lot of tension about who tells the story and how, about what parts of the story are good, about what it means to be an American, about statues and Confederate monuments, about the flag, about the national anthem. In the last few years, there's been a lot of energy focused around the 1619 Project or the 1776 Project or critical race theory. Alongside these, you have centuries-old discussions about whether or not America is a Christian country and what that would even mean. All of these discussions can be lively, if I put a nice spin on things. The truth is, they can be more than lively. They can be disruptive, even threatening. So I rather fear I am going to be disappointing almost everyone with what I say, in part because we have to move so quickly. My standard wine line. Oh well. Let me start by reviewing the basics of the American Revolution, and we'll move from there. So, as we're moving through the second half of the 18th century, the 13 colonies, which had been under British rule for some time, but which are 3,000 miles away from Britain and enjoyed quite a bit of freedom. As we move through the second half of the 18th century, Britain begins to try and reel them in a bit. Britain had often been at war. They had not had the emotional energy or the troops or the interest to sort of pay close attention to what was going on in the colonies. In the late 1760s, that changes and Britain tries to exert a bit more control, in part to get some money out of the colonies to help offset the cost of the war they had just fought with France. The French and Indian War, which was not a fight between the French and the Indians. It was a fight between the French and the Spanish, and it was over the colonies in North America. Britain had won, so Britain and some indigenous people had fought against France and some other indigenous people. Britain had won, and now they're looking to get some funding, some money out of the colonies in order to help cover their war costs. And this is going to come in the way of taxes, which are, of course, always a popular idea. This is going to lead to a series of legal and ultimately physical skirmishes between the colonies and Britain. First, it's the Stamp Act, which was a tax. Britain levies it, the colonists protest, in large part because this is the line we learn in grade school, taxation without representation. So the Stamp Act is repealed, but it's followed by something not very different, the Townsend Act. And the Townsend Act is levying costs on a variety of things, including tea. So there's a new round of pushback, and this time the Brits send soldiers over to enforce the Townsend Act. Things go wrong. Some soldiers, feeling threatened by colonist protests, fire into the crowd. A couple colonists die. This is referred to as the Boston Massacre. So given the tensions and the problems of the Boston Massacre, the Brits did away with most of the Townsend Act, but they kept the tax on tea. This leads to the Boston Tea Party, which took place in December of 1773. And in response to the Boston Tea Party, the Brits levy some more taxes, and they send a whole new wave of legislation jumbled together that's called by the colonists the Intolerable Acts. So they push back and the Brits send more troops. Massachusetts is under now military rule, and they say they're going to be under military rule until the colonists in Massachusetts pay for all the tea and all the taxes. So, by the way, in a lesser known move around this time, also heightening a lot of the tension, is that the Brits passed what's called the Quebec Act. And the Quebec Act is where they give to the colonists in Canada, the Catholic colonists in Canada, Quebec, the area known as Quebec, to be a Catholic enclave amidst what is otherwise a largely Protestant area. So the Protestants in North America, in what's going to become the United States, really do not like the fact that the Brits have given land in Canada to the Catholics, and they fear that the Brits are going to try and do the same thing in the southern part, the North America, south of Canada. So while all this is going on, the colonists decide that they're going to have to organize together. So the colonies were acting pretty independently of each other at this time. In 1774, representatives from almost every colony assemble in Philadelphia for the first Continental Congress. I know this is all coming back to you because you stayed awake in high school when you had your American Civ class, unlike me and others. We had to learn it later. But anyway, so the colonists begin to get together. This is the first Continental Congress. And so when they come together, they are starting to think that they're going to separate from Great Britain. Now, we just, hey, we're 200, 250 years later, we're like, well, of course they're going to separate from Great Britain. Because America is America. It's big, it's powerful, it's so much wealthier, and it's got so much bigger GDP and so much bigger of a military than Great Britain. Well, those things were not true back then. And there were other factors. First of all, Great Britain's got a huge navy. Great Britain's got the money. Great Britain's got the soldiers. The colonies don't. Great Britain also is sort of got official power. And Romans 13 is a real problem for a lot of the colonists. So Romans 13 is this passage written by the Apostle Paul in which he calls on people, to live in subjection to government rulers. And at the time, generally understood, Paul's talking about Nero. And Nero is a complete world-class jerk and tyrant and horrible in so many ways beyond what King Charles in Great Britain is. And so the thought is, well, if Paul's saying to the Christians back in the first century that they had to obey Nero, we probably have to obey Charles. And it's going to take a while for them to process through this. Additionally, this whole idea of being a democracy is a new idea. For all of time, basically, there had been elites who had power and had been in control, and you had to pay taxes to them, and you had to sort of, you had to sort of kiss up to them. And so it was just, that was the way people understood it. This whole American culture of rugged individualists and representation and all this is sort of new stuff. So students of history will know that there's a lot of ink spilled asking the question, how is it exactly that the American colonists are going to get these democratic ideas? So you have democracy earlier, you've got democracy back with the Greeks. But it's nothing like what is going to be rolling out in North America. So many historians will write, and they will give credit for this idea, these democratic ideals and human rights and all this. They're going to give credit to Enlightenment philosophy. I'm in the camp that would say, well, yeah, sure, some of this clearly comes from the Enlightenment, but I would argue that the ideas of individual rights and the ideas of human dignity that shape all of that, these find a much more ancient soil than the Enlightenment. They go back to the Bible. Think about it. A long time before Washington and Jefferson, a long time before the Enlightenment, you have got people like, the John and Peter standing up to the religious leaders who are telling them, you got to stop talking about Jesus or we're going to lock you up or we're going to kill you. And they say in the book of Acts, hey, you got to do what you got to do. We got to do what we got to do. Do you think it's better for us to obey God or you, we've sort of determined we're obeying God and we're going to do what we need to do. And so, just a few chapters earlier, the apostles had been sort of meek and meekly and hiding, and they're not able. Peter, good grief, he can't stand up to the young woman who says, "Hey, weren't you with Jesus around the fire?" He's going to deny Jesus 3 times. Now they're finding a new gear and resolve, and they are going to start to stand up against the authorities. And so there's going to be a lot of people who are going to look back and say, this idea, these American individualist, democratic ideas are going to be coming out of the church and finding their way into America. And so, there's pushback on this. I don't want you to think that there's not. There's pushback. Good grief, there's pushback on the idea of Western civilization, which is the broader category that we've been looking at. Certainly within the teaching on Western civilization, you've got even more pushback on the idea that these ideals are decidedly Christian or Jewish, Judeo-Christian in their nature. So anyway, but I digress. Let me get back here. The point is, back to the colonists, around the time of 1774, most of them are going to be reaching the conclusion that they're going to have to break away from England. And so we start to see them take some steps in this direction. For instance, there's going to be the creation of the Minutemen, because there is no standing army per se, but the Minutemen are colonists who can be ready on a minute's notice to fight against the British. This is going to be when Paul Revere is going to make his midnight ride, alerting the Minutemen, because they've got more Brits coming over to on their way to Massachusetts to sort of push down the agitation being caused by the colonists and their pushback on all the taxes. And so it's going to be after Paul Revere's ride, we got the Battle of Lexington and Concord, where the first shot is fired, the shot that's heard around the world. And so this is the start. The shot heard around the world is the start of the American Revolution. And certainly there are other iconic moments. There's a Second Continental Congress that's going to happen around this time in Philadelphia. This is where they're going to raise up an army. George Washington is going to be put in charge. On July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress is going to sign the Declaration of Independence, at which, in one sense, the 13 colonies are now the United States of America. And then there will be the war that's going to go on for a handful of years, and it will look more so than I understood when I was a high school student. It will look like the Brits would prevail. Certainly, there are some very low points when Washington and his troops out of New York flee, get across New Jersey and into Pennsylvania. That happens on Christmas night, where they got to cross the Delaware River. He had 2,400 troops with him. The whole Valley Forge, they're freezing to death. Lots of people are dying because of lack of nutrition and lack of heat. There will be a number of times when it looks like the Brits are going to prevail, but then there will be victories by the colonists. And while there's more bad times ahead, at some point, Washington and his troops are going to begin to prevail, and then the battle moves further south, and more victories are won. And in 1781, there will be the surrender of the British general Charles Cornwallis, and then following that, we've got John Adams and Ben Franklin and John Jay are going to go to France and negotiate a peace treaty. That'll take place over, it'll be in 1783 that the Paris Peace Treaty is finally announced, with terms very favorable to America. Britain concedes that they've lost. Britain grants the United States their independence, all the British holdings. which is, most of the land east of the Mississippi, not Florida at the time. Spain owned Florida. All the water rights to the Mississippi, whatever land Britain owned west of the Mississippi. And remember, at the time, you've got, you're going to have a lot of this land is not part of the United States. It's owned by the French. And so Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, will negotiate the Louisiana Purchase and buy all of that. So there's other things that happened in this peace treaty. Among them, there's like 60,000 Brits living in America who are granted the opportunity to leave. And so many of them will go to Canada. Some of them will go back to Great Britain. But you've got this peace treaty that takes place in 1783. And then you've got all the work that's going to go into everybody figuring out how are we going to get along. And so you've got a Declaration of Independence, and at some point you're going to have a constitution, but you don't have everybody buying in, and you've got states that are going to organize against each other and charge tariffs. And there's a whole process of evolution. You got to have the Bill of Rights put in place so people are content that they're not going to lose their rights to the federal government. So there's a number of things. I'm going to assume that you know all about Thomas Jefferson. I mean, again, I said, what do we do with Jefferson? He's amazing in so many ways. He's brilliant. He's going to not only, sort of channel Locke and come up with the Declaration of Independence. He is going to be a lawyer. He's going to be a legislator in Virginia. He's going to go to the Continental Congress. Then he's going to start to rise up through the ranks. He writes the Declaration of Independence. Then he's going to be Secretary of State for George Washington. He is going to become the Vice President of the United States under John Adams. He's going to become the President of the United States. He's going to negotiate the Louisiana Purchase. I mean, he's going to do a lot of things. He's also going to own somewhere between 200 and 400 slaves. By the way, another thing that Jefferson does, just to sort of make him more iconic, I mean, he also starts the University of Virginia, designs it. He designs Monticello, continues to refine it, works as an architect. But he's also going to die on July 4th, 50 years to the date after signing the Declaration of Independence. So, look, I'm going to assume you know about Jefferson, you know about Washington, you know about Ben Franklin and John Adams and all of these people. Remarkable people. And it's also remarkable just that you've got them around at the same time, because they're really doing some just brilliant thinking and looking ahead. And it's very amazing that you get them all at the same time. I want to talk just a little bit more about the documents. So just to note the paper trail. So we tend to think of the Declaration of Independence, which is a little bit more of a theological document, certainly than the Constitution, a lot more religious language in the Declaration of Independence than there is in the Constitution. But this all sort of starts back with the Magna Carta. Remember, Latin for the Great Charter. And this is what the noblemen, back in the 13th century, when King John of Robin Hood fame, he's Prince John, his brother, King Richard the Lionhearted, is off fighting, and Prince John is in Robin Hood stories is sort of the hapless ne'er-do-well one. But he is going to be forced by his leaders to sign the Magna Carta, which basically says he's going to follow the law. The king is going to be subject to the law. This is a huge, important document, and it will be important in British history, but it will also be moving people forward towards the other documents. So we then have, again, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. There are other documents that deserve our attention, such as the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So Federalist Papers, there's a number of these things, and they are significant and important and pretty amazing to read. But we're water skiing, so what I want to use the rest of my time on is to talk about some of, I want to talk about what I think is the preeminent question that I get, and that is are we supposed to think of the founding of America as a Christian activity? Was America a Christian nation? How do we process all of that? So the question at hand, is the United States a Christian country? There is always a lot of energy around this question, so much so that I feel the need to start by noting that, again, I don't think my answer is going to satisfy all of you. For starters, we have to pull apart the question. Like, what actually are we asking? Are we talking about today, or are we talking about in the past? Most people, I think, say we're talking about the past. The question is, was America founded as a Christian nation? Okay, well, what do we mean Christian nation? And what exactly do we mean when we're talking about founding? Like when Columbus showed up? Or are we talking about the founding fathers? Or are we talking about during the Great Awakening? And, again, the questions go on. So let me just say, when I listen to people argue that America is a Christian nation, they generally make 5 points. So, number one, they say the early settlers were Christians. By the way, I'm going to push back on all of these, and then I'm going to push back on pushing back. So if I've already made you mad, hang in there. Number one, the early settlers were Christians. The initial pilgrims were deeply pious men and women who loved Christ and sought a place to worship him freely and without persecution. All you have to do is to read their diaries. All you have to do is to look at the Mayflower Compact, right? Another great document in sort of the lineage between the Magna Carta and the Declaration of Independence. And it's not just the first pilgrims, it's also the Puritans who followed them. They come for slightly different reasons, but they also, while they're not fleeing religious persecution in the same sense, they are coming in part out of a sense of mission around Christ and his kingdom. Read their journals, or note that the first thing that they build are churches. Read the sermons that were preached in those churches. They were Christ followers. The New England Confederation reads, "We all came into these parts of America with one and the same end and aim, namely to advance the kingdom of our Lord Jesus Christ." In other words, if you're over the age of 40, and I'm barely, but I'm 60. If you're over the age of 40, what you were taught in school is probably true. But if you're under the age of 30, then what you were taught in school was probably not. The settlers fled Europe for religious reasons. They arrived in the New World in hopes of establishing, in the words of John Winthrop, the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, who takes this line from Jesus himself, a shining city on a hill, a beacon of the gospel, a bright light that would dispel the darkness of sin. So the first thing I hear people saying about, is America a Christian nation? They go, yes, it's founded by Christians. Number two, it's not just the founding and the early Puritans, it's also 100 years later, we find that the founders, 150 years later, the founders of the nation are deeply religious people. And not just that, but some of those who were religious were also deeply Christian, as you see with all the creeds. In England, they didn't call it the American Revolution. They called it the Presbyterian Rebellion. And Prime Minister Horace Wallace said, "Cousin America has run off with a Presbyterian parson." So it is, at the time of the founding, it's Christians that are doing this. The third argument made, they set up a form of government that was profoundly shaped by the Christian faith. So there are a variety of ways in which the United States founding documents reflect this. They reflect the value of human life that we find given in Scripture. The way they divide power reflects an understanding of the depravity of humans and the need to divide power. None other than Earl Warren, who, when he said this, was governor of California. Warren will become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and at the time, make a number of rulings that a lot of Christians don't like. But Warren writes when he's governor, "I believe no one can read the history of our country without realizing that the good book and the spirit of the Savior have from the beginning been our guiding genius. Whether we look to the first charter of Virginia, or to the charter of New England, or to the charter of Massachusetts Bay, or to the fundamental orders of Connecticut, the same objective is present: a Christian land to be governed by Christians." So in the Federalist Papers, written by Madison, number 51, we have another statement worth reading. "But what is government but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external or internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this: you must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself." So he's just reflecting this understanding of human depravity that shapes all the American systems of checks and balances. The fourth reason I hear people put forward to say that America is a Christian nation is that the founding of the country and its survival clearly reflect the providential hand of God, that you cannot study American history and not sense God's care, the manifest destiny that was behind America. God is the architect. It is a Christian nation. And the fifth, the final that I'll mention, reason I hear people saying America is a Christian country is that since we have turned our back on God, in other words, taking prayer out of schools, the sexual revolution, abortion on demand, whatever is going to be cited, since those things have happened, we have lost some of our greatness. So, those who say that America is not a Christian country respond to those who say that it is on a point-by-point basis. To the claim that America, the early settlers were Christians, they say, no, there were already people living in America at the time that the settlers from Europe came. The people that were living here were not Christians, and the way the so-called Christians treated the people who were here was not very loving or Christian. And one of the first things the settlers did, by the way, this group of people who fled their homeland because they were not granted religious freedom, is they proceeded to deny religious freedom to the people that didn't think exactly like they did. So what do we mean when we say Christian? Because we don't see lots of people acting like we suspect your Jesus would act. To the second point, to the idea that the founders also had a deep faith in Christ, they say, well, certainly not all of them, indeed not the main ones. Not Thomas Jefferson, not Ben Franklin, not George Washington. These people were deists. They were not Christians. And the government they set up, by the way, was not Christian. They went out of their way to make sure that there was a separation of the church from the state. Just read the First Amendment. To point number 3, to the idea that the Christians set up a Christian form of government that was shaped profoundly by Christian understandings of humanity, say, no, the government that was set up was shaped by the Enlightenment. Jefferson was channeling John Locke, not Jesus. To number 4, to the idea that the founding of our country and its survival were clearly providentially controlled blessings at the hand of God. They say, really, wow, you're going out on a limb here. In fact, you're probably crazy. Most of the people who showed up on the Mayflower died quickly upon arriving. The history of the United States is a history of war and witch trials and depressions and dust bowls. All these things are in place until science saves the day. And finally, to number 5, since we have turned our back on God by taking prayer out of school, all these bad things have begun to happen. they say, oh, well, clearly you must be a white male because you're being very selective in how you tell the story. Things are going to better today than they ever have gone before by almost every measurable statistic. Child mortality, life expectancy, wealth, literacy, and in dozens of other areas. In addition to those things, they would say, we're not sure what's Christian about slavery or racism. The moment you mention the initial settlers in the 16th century and the founding in the 18th century were religious moments, but the other times, those were the most religious moments. And so it just so happens that you're sort of cherry picking the time when you've got the most religious statements being made. Remember, the Constitution does not mention God, and who cares if it was founded as a Christian nation? Don't want to concede that point, but who cares if it was? That was 250 years ago. It's not today. So then, this group comes back and says, to the idea that the early settlers were cruel to indigenous people. They say, oh yes, you want to talk about the noble savages and celebrate their lifestyle of ongoing warfare, child sacrifice, illiteracy, all those things. Was what the settlers did perfect? No, not at all. And among the biggest tragedies was the introduction into North America of all the diseases that the Europeans had built up some antibodies to, but that wiped out a lot of the Indians. And so they'll say, yes, there are problems, but the settlers brought the gospel, and they brought education, and they brought health care and other things. To the idea that most of the founders were deists, were not Christians, they respond, oh, come on, just read their journals, read their prayers, read their commentaries about Christ. Yes, Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin were not card-carrying evangelicals, but they were people who saw a profound need for the Christian faith, and they focused very much on Jesus and his teaching. To the claim that they went out of their way to establish a separation of church and state, they say, the First Amendment was not set up to prevent the church from influencing the state. It was set up to prevent the state from controlling in any way the church. So you can see that they understood and expected influence from the church. In 1782, the first Congress voted to print the first Bible in the United States, and it was the Congress that formed the American Bible Society. The first meeting of the Supreme Court opened with a 4-hour communion service. The Capitol Rotunda was used as a church until 1880. Of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, 27 had seminary degrees. As late as the 18th and early 19th centuries, there were religious tests for anyone who wanted to run for state office. This was true in Connecticut, Rhode Island, Georgia, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Vermont. Basically everywhere except Virginia and New York. Derek Davis, the author of a book on faith in the founders, states that the journals of the Continental Congress, quote, are so filled with biblical phrases as to resemble Old Testament ecclesiastical documents. He also states that in the 1770s, America, quote, was still so overwhelmingly biblically orthodox in its worldview that the religious dimensions of civil government were simply taken for granted. The new government was constantly seeking divine aid. 13 times we see them appealing to Jesus Christ for help. Other times, appealing to the Holy Spirit. We establish early on military chaplains. The entire Congress will attend worship services. There will be proclamations of days of fasting and prayer. Again, you can read the journals of the Continental Congress and their efforts to try and share the gospel with the Indians. So, clearly, during the 17th, 18th, and a good part of the 19th century, the understanding of this idea of separation of church and state did not mean that the church could not influence the state. To the idea that Jefferson was channeling Locke, not Jesus, they say he may have drifted that way when he starts to advise them on the French Revolution, But no, he is clearly much more grounded with Jesus than he was with Enlightenment thinking, and on you go. Now, as you can imagine, there's another round of counterclaims that go to these claims. And this is the nature of the study of history. Look, I think we need to be humble as we come about this question. There is no simple answer. Were the early founders, the early settlers, primarily Christians? Yes, they're shaped by a Judeo-Christian worldview. No question about it. Did they always act in ideal ways? Absolutely not. Did they make lots of mistakes? Absolutely so. Was the government of the United States set up with Judeo-Christian worldview predominantly driving it? Absolutely yes. Were there lots of mistakes and sinful activity? Absolutely. So, look, I think we have to, we're going to have to continue to trace this discussion and the development of Western culture and the United States, which we're going to continue to do, but that's going to wrap things up for this episode. When we come back, we're either going to be looking at the very critical issue of First Amendment rights and how those are understood and how they are going to develop, or we're going to be looking at some of the 18th century contributions coming out of art and music and literature. So hang in there. See you next time.